on the BBC iPlayer. But our thanks again to Josie Cox, the business commentator, and David Wooding from The Sun on Sunday. Thanks for all your review of today's newspapers. Plenty there for all of you. Boris Johnson and other stories too. But goodbye from us.
Hello, after such a lovely start to the weekend, things not so straightforward today. Well, many of us have noticed already more cloud around compared with yesterday. And whilst most will actually stay dry, at least during daylight hours, there is a weather system coming in towards the southwest, which is bringing some rain here. And as that feeds northwards tonight, there could be some torrential, thundery downpours out of it. But it is across parts of southwest England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We get the thickest cloud today, the breeze picking up as well, and some outbreaks of rain gradually moving further north and east. Elsewhere, just some hazy sunshine to be had. And whilst many are dry, north of the central belt in Scotland, a few showers. A warmer day for East Anglia and across southeast England, a few spots into the mid-20s. Feels a bit cooler along some North Sea coast with more of a breeze, very high pollen in England and Wales. Here's the rain tonight moving northwards. North Wales, northern England at the greater risk of seeing some torrential thundery downpours, maybe 20 to 50 millimetres out of this. So there could be some disruption. All that feeds into Scotland as the night goes on. The rain heaviest towards the east and a very wet start to Monday, particularly across northeastern parts of Scotland. And then during Monday, well, there will be a dry, cloudy start for many, but showers and storms start to break out again through southern England, the Midlands, towards northern England, especially northeast England, feeding back towards eastern Scotland. Again, these areas at the greater risk of seeing some disruptive downpours, risk of flash flooding, hail, gusty winds, frequent lightning with some of these. Warmest again in East Anglia and southeast England, very humid though with the warmth here. As we go through Monday night, still some wet weather in Scotland. We could see another area of perhaps torrential thundery downpours with frequent lightning working up across southeast and eastern England, clearing on Tuesday morning, and elsewhere on Tuesday a few more showers and storms start to break out, but by no means everywhere. There'll be some hazy sunshine here and there, warmth and humidity as well. So a very active weather pattern to start the week. It looks like it turns quieter later in the week, high pressure becoming more dominant, tapping into some hotter air becoming established across continental Europe. So the southern and western parts of the UK in particular going into next weekend, temperatures could be soaring. Some spots may even be into the low 30s. It's already very warm at Valenciennes, where the England Lionesses are in action this afternoon. That's your forecast.
What sort of world are we in?
Tweet that. You don't mind, do you?
No.
Years and Years. Box set available now on BBC iPlayer.
No doubt about it. He's been murdered.
First we thought maybe it was a robbery gone wrong, but he's still got his wallet and his phone.
You don't think I should be here, do you?
No, well, you don't know where your wife is. Get after him!
Where is she?
What do you think about the DI's wife? I think she's dead.
The possibility that we might find her. It's all I've got.
London Kills starts tomorrow at 1:45 on BBC One.
In an hour, we've got all the latest news and debate from Sunday politics. But first, on BBC One, it's Andrew Marr.
Good morning. There's a rule in politics. If there is universal agreement about anything at Westminster, then everybody is wrong. This rule covers everything from the referendum vote to the results of elections, and this weekend we've been reminded of it again. Everybody knew, it was obvious, that Boris Johnson was going to walk it as the next Tory leader. Well, maybe he will win, even convincingly. But after that domestic row, whether it's something or whether it's nothing, he is not going to walk through this campaign. In politics, as in life, we have to be constantly prepared for the unexpected. We think we know things, and then stuff happens. I'm joined this morning, exactly 3 years since the referendum, by one of the leading pro-Brexit voices then and now, the International Trade Secretary Liam Fox, and as Jeremy Corbyn faces pressure to tilt towards another referendum by one of the Labour MPs pleading with him to keep faith with Leave voters, Caroline Flint. And from the other side of the argument, the former New Labour minister, who many in his party still consider their prince over the water, David Miliband. The historian David Olusoga is here to discuss the Whitehall archives he says reveal a sinister new side to the Windrush scandal. And we have some sublime music from a rising star, the saxophonist Jess Gillam. On the news review, the Telegraph's assistant editor Camilla Tominey, the Yorkshire Post's Westminster correspondent Liz Bates, and Novara Media's Ash Sarkar. But first, the news with Roger Johnson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. A neighbour of Boris Johnson and his partner has defended calling the police after overhearing a row at the couple's flat and passing a recording of the incident to a newspaper. Tom Penn says his sole concern had been the couple's safety. Mr Johnson brushed aside questions about what happened at the first Tory leadership hustings in Birmingham yesterday. The Foreign Office Minister Andrew Murrison is meeting the Iranian government in Tehran and calling for an urgent de-escalation of the tensions in the region. It's being reported that the US launched a cyber attack on Iranian weapons systems on Thursday as President Trump pulled out of airstrikes on the country. It comes after the shooting down of an American drone, as well as attacks on oil tankers, which the US blamed on Iran. A large-scale campaign to plant fake content on Facebook and Twitter has been uncovered by a group of researchers. The Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab says the material originates from Russia and is still going on, but has had little impact. The Russian state has always denied that it's involved in so-called influence operations. England's rivers are reaching crisis point, according to conservationists, with climate change and water extraction being blamed. Last year's heatwave and dry winter caused chalk streams across the country to dry up because the underground layer which feeds them, the aquifer, had next to no source of water. The Environment Agency says that it has cut abstractions, but campaigners say that stronger action is needed. And an 81-year-old has become the oldest woman to cycle from Land's End to John O'Groats. Mavis Patterson from Dumfries and Galloway took 23 days to complete the 960-mile journey. It was in memory of her 3 grown-up children who all died within 4 years of each other. Mavis raised more than £60,000 for charity. Very well done to her. That's all from me. The next news on BBC One is at 12:30. Andrew, back to you.
Many thanks for that, Roger. And now to the front pages, bubbling and boiling with one story only. There's the front page of the Mail on Sunday. Bust up Boris, hit by shock poll blow, which is basically that people are not impressed by the latest story and are gathering around Jeremy Hunt as a potential Prime Minister, they say. The Sunday Express is as disobliging to Boris Johnson as that one was. Why won't Boris tell us what happened? That's relating, of course, to the hustings yesterday where he dodged the questions about the Carrie Simons row. But Carrie Simons, in a more friendly way, has been speaking, or friends of hers have been speaking to The Sun and given her verdict. It's all a stitch-up by left-wing neighbours, and that is also the view taken by the Sunday Telegraph. Left-wing neighbours admit taping Boris row, and people are asking, what kind of country is it where you can't have a row without your neighbours taping it and calling the police? And there's the Sunday Times. Boris is a security risk. This is allegedly 2 cabinet ministers gossiping, saying that he will be blackmailed and there'll be further leaks to come out. And they've got a whole series of stories which we'll talk about inside that paper. Very, very interesting. And then finally, the Sunday Mirror. Boris row was so frightening, I had to call police, says the neighbour involved. So where are we going to start? We're going to start with that story. That is the only place to start.
Yeah, it's everything today is about kind of Boris backlash, and obviously we saw the story emerge in The Guardian on Friday night, and it was all about the row that Boris Johnson had with his girlfriend Carrie Simons, and the neighbours there had called the police and made a recording in their hallway and then passed that to The Guardian. And now what we've seen over the weekend, and particularly all over the papers today, is the scrutiny has turned from Boris and his girlfriend to the neighbours that made the recording.
So it's gone from the story to the story about the story. And of
Yes.
course, this is technology. Because of these mobile phones, anything can be recorded or filmed at any time.
Yeah, and so the newspapers are looking at who are these people, and I think trying to look more into what their motivation is. And the suggestion in some of the papers this morning is that their motivation might be political. That's certainly what's being hinted at in the Sunday Times. This is the way that they describe the neighbours. Their names are Tom Penn and Eve Lee. They are left-wing dramatists. There's some great descriptions of them in here. Lee is an enthusiastic Buddhist. In terms of like her playwriting career, she's getting some.
It all sounds exactly as if it was written by Jennifer Sanders out of Ab Fab. I mean,
it's quite
it's great social
silly.
comedy in a way.
Yeah, and apparently she gave Boris Johnson the finger in the street. So the implication behind all of this is that
It's all a political stitch-up.
There's an ulterior motive here.
Ash.
I mean, I think that this coverage of the political views of the neighbours is actually weirdly McCarthyite. This idea that because they voted Labour, because they were pro-EU, because she gave the finger to Boris Johnson in the street, the way like 50% of Londoners, I think, would, that they shouldn't be trusted, and that their motivations for recording the row, the screaming, the smashing were malign, and that, you know, James Cleverly saying that the big element of the story is that they called the police at all. And the reason why I feel so strongly about this is because I think that this has got negative consequences beyond the Westminster pony show.
For other women who are perhaps shouting in a room and hoping that somebody's going to
Absolutely,
hear them.
because having a row in which you shout and you say things you don't mean, that's a normal part of relationships. Screaming, get off me at midnight, hearing thuds, hearing smashing, those things aren't normal. Physical intimidation is not a normal part of relationships.
Yeah, we don't know that's what he was doing, of course.
Well, no, but from the recording, we don't know whether that was Boris or not, but saying that that form of conflict and physical intimidation, no matter what side it's on, is not a normal part of relationships. And to see MPs and right-wing pundits just fall over themselves to normalise it, I think is incredibly irresponsible.
I'm not sure if it's normalisation. I think there's a bit of context put into how the recordings were made. There's a suggestion here from the guy, Tom, saying that his sole concern was the welfare and safety of my neighbours. And yet at the same time, we have friends of Carrie's here speaking to The Sun, saying at no point did she fear for her safety. They had a row. Lots of couples have them. They questioned some of the behaviour of the neighbours, including posters being put up, anti-Boris, hate mail that they've received, the so-called two-fingered salute, which I believe the female protagonist in this, she tried to delete that from her Twitter feed. You know, I suppose there could be an argument that if anyone else had been affected by this, and if there'd been a recording of perhaps somebody on the left, you would have the likes of Hacktoff's Steve Coogan and Hugh Grant saying, hang on, isn't this a gross invasion of privacy?
I can tell we're not going to agree on this. I'd like to move on, however, to the bigger question, a sense of, does this matter? Is it going to change people's minds? Is it going to derail or change or alter the leadership contest in any way at all? And there's a poll in the Mail on Sunday, I think, which suggests the answer may be yes.
So the first poll in the Mail on Sunday suggests when it comes to all voters, and they've really got up to the minute polling here. So on Thursday, 36% of all voters were in favour of Boris Johnson over Jeremy Hunt, and then by Saturday that had fallen from 36% to 29%, with Jeremy Hunt overtaking Boris and on 32%. If you ask Tory voters, there's less of an impact. So on Thursday, 55% were behind Boris. On Saturday, 45% were behind him. So a little bit of a drop-off, which would be reflected in the hustings of some boos for questions. What's interesting is the effect on actual Tory councillors. It's all very well talking about what the country thinks, but obviously the only people that have a vote are Tory members when it comes to deciding the next Prime Minister. And according to this poll, Comres in the Sunday Telegraph, Boris Johnson is 22 points ahead with the grassroots.
He felt before this that he was unstoppable, because it was not just that he had a big lead, but that people were saying they weren't going to change their mind either. And that is probably still the overall sense of the papers today.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing, though, about the Mail on Sunday poll is the thing that came up in my mind was that during this leadership campaign, there have been a lot of MPs, a lot of Tory MPs that you wouldn't have expected to support Boris Johnson. I think the phrase around Westminster has been that there are people holding their nose and supporting Boris Johnson. And that is because they believe that he can deliver them a general election
win. They can see where power is going,
yes.
And they're following it.
And when we get this poll in the Mail on Sunday, it's just one poll. We don't know if it's a trend. But that shows that among all voters, you know, Hunt is sort of edging into the lead. So a lot of those Tory MPs might be kind of having second thoughts. It's too late for them, but they might be regretting their decision.
And we've got some very interesting kind of pro and anti-Boris Johnson commentators writing in the paper. Sunday Times has got this big spread of Sonia Purnell writing very vividly about his temper, and on the other side, Andrew Jimson, his biographer, supporting him. They're both biographers, actually.
So they're putting the two sides forward in reaction to what's happened. And what Sonia Purnell is saying is that Boris's temper and his way of treating women is kind of well known in Westminster, and that makes him unfit for office. And then we have Andrew Gimson, as you say, on the other side. I'm not sure where that is, but Andrew Gimson on the other side, who is basically saying that, you know, he's a different kind of politician. This is already priced in. People know that he has a chaotic private life. And people like it because it's exciting. And people think that Jeremy Hunt is too boring.
I mean, the interesting thing about Andrew Jimson's defence of Boris Johnson is that reading it, you feel a bit like you're being gaslit, because in one paragraph, you've got Boris Johnson's famous denial that he had an affair, where he says that categorically there was no affair, it's an inverted pyramid of piffle. Then the next paragraph down, Jimson quotes one of Johnson's family members, and he says, oh no, what he really meant is it's none of your business. So, of course, that's not what he meant. It was a categorical denial. It was lying to the public about his private life. You can say whether or not you think those things should be up for discussion, but it was a lie. Next paragraph down is, oh no, it's not really a lie. So even in these defences of Boris Johnson, they can't get around his fundamental dishonesty.
Yeah. For me, the most important story in the papers really was in the Sunday Times looking at the parliamentary numbers, because whether it's Jeremy Hunt who wins this in the end, or whether it's Boris Johnson, the new Tory leader faces a really, really difficult Commons confrontation over Brexit, but much else as well.
Yeah, so they say that Boris Johnson's always one banana skin away from catastrophe, and then when he's actually in office, the suggestion being here in the Sunday Times that within 24 hours Labour will have a no confidence motion. To be fair, speaking to Liam Fox earlier in the Green Room, he made the point that there has to be two no confidence motions, because under the Fixed Term Parliament Act there would be an initial no confidence motion, and then that would have to be cause some kind of
12
recalibration.
Days or something to resolve it.
Having said that, this is where the arithmetic gets interesting. So currently the Tories have a 4-strong working majority. We've had the recall petition for Chris Davies, and it's looking as if the Liberal Democrats might win that seat back. We don't know.
That's Breton and Radnor, which they won in the past, of course.
Exactly, so that would take it down to 3. And there's a number of Tory MPs. The paper here lists Guto Bebb as one, and also Philip Lee, both staunch Remainers. We've got the situation where two of the ballot papers...
Philip Lee has been deselected already.
Indeed, and we've got a situation where 2 ballot papers were spoiled, which went down to 1 in the final 5th ballot.
We still don't know who they are.
We still don't know who they are. So is there a point here that some Tories may vote with Labour in a motion of no confidence to bring Boris down? But equally, there are knives to be pulled out of his back at every turn. You've got, on one hand, the Remainers trying to unseat this whole idea that he could take us out with a no deal. You've then got some hardline ERGers like Steve Baker and others saying, if he doesn't make us leave by the 31st of October, we're going to have him. The quote here being, we can make him and we can break him. So it's like as soon as he's in office...
It's a very, very fragile situation to walk into. I said Philip Lee had been deselected. He hasn't been. I was wrong. He lost a confidence vote. But
that's right.
He's one of quite a few Tory MPs who the Tory whips think might defect the Liberal Democrats. So the whole thing is it's papery thin, really.
There was some plotting apparently in Portcullis House on Thursday afternoon between Lee, Dominic Grieve, Sam Guimard, Richard Harrington and Antoinette Sambach, who are all ardent Remainers, and they're not going to stand by and let Boris bulldoze her through, no deal.
But it's hard to see. One of the things that we have been talking about for a long time is the fact that, yes, it is very precarious for the Tory party, and they could end up in this position where some of their MPs vote against their own government and trigger a general election. Where is a general election going to get us? I mean, that's the question for me, and I'm not sure that anybody else really knows the answer to that.
There is politics happening on the other side of the chamber as well, of course, Ash. There's 2 interesting stories about Labour I'd like you to mention. One is the Tom Watson story, saying.
So it's a Sunday, which means that Tom Watson's been briefing the Observer, and what he's saying is that Labour have dangerously underestimated the scale of the crisis it faces when it comes to its Brexit position. Tom Watson strongly feels that Labour need to unequivocally take not just a view that there should be a confirmatory vote or a second referendum, that Labour must come out for Remain in full throat.
Our hearts are Remain, he said, yeah.
And the thing is, I have some sympathy with the element of this saying that Labour needs to take a stronger line on Brexit. I think that their attempt to depolarise the issue was noble, if doomed. And now they're in a position where they can either harden their Brexit position, which is impossible, or pivot towards Remain. I think, however, this idea of our hearts are Remain and our values are Remain is a bit more dangerous. I think that Euroscepticism does go very deep in this country, and it is something which is important to lots of Labour voters, even Labour voters who did vote Remain. And so I wonder if this will prove to be more divisive.
We're almost out of time, but we've got the Yorkshire Post here, so I can't avoid asking about the Northern Powerhouse story.
Of course.
In the Mirror. They're saying basically Theresa May has offered lots of money, but it's not real new money.
No, I mean, it's not real new money. It's just sort of a bit of a... it's part of her, I think, whole thing about trying to carve out her legacy. I mean, it's quite funny, actually, to watch what's going on over the last 2 weeks with Theresa May. It's like she sort of found a to-do list in her house that she's had there for 2 years, and suddenly she started just ticking things off. I mean, we've seen things on, you know, mental health and Windrush, and now we have this promise about the Northern Powerhouse. It's empty. There's no new cash to it. But I feel positive about the fact that some of the Tory leadership candidates have been talking about the Northern Powerhouse, including Boris. So at least it's back on the agenda.
That's a positive way to end. Thanks all very much indeed. And so to the weather. After a week when we finally began to experience some summer, the week ahead sounds like it's going to be very dramatic. Soaring temperatures, huge thunderstorms. Over to Nick Miller in the Weather Centre. Nick. And there
Andrew,
they are.
A very accurate summary, and there are some Met Office weather warnings in force for thunderstorms that could bring some disruption over the next few days. Already today, we're noticing more cloud out there compared with yesterday. Whilst many will stay dry, a few showers in Scotland, north of the Central Belt, but here comes the rain into parts of southwest England, Wales, the Midlands and Northern Ireland as we go deeper into the day with a freshening wind. A bit warmer in southeast England, a little cooler along North Sea coast, very high pollen levels in England and Wales. Let's take a look at the rain though, as this pushes its way northwards across the UK, much of the UK. Tonight there could be some torrential downpours through particularly North Wales and Northern England, then heading on towards eastern parts of Scotland. Big range of rainfall totals, but in some spots there could be some flooding and travel disruption going into the morning. And then for Monday, after a very wet start across eastern parts of Scotland, showers and thunderstorms develop elsewhere. Now, not everybody's going to see some. Northern Ireland at risk, parts of England and Wales, some through southern England, the Midlands on towards northern England, for example, and more across southeast and eastern England on Monday night. So a stormy start to the week, but like it or loathe it, by the end of the week, some spots could be into the low 30s. Andrew.
Wow. Now, one story we didn't get to in the paper review, but a very big one, is the crisis over Iran. It feels like it's getting more intense by the minute. President Trump, having boasted about being cocked and loaded and ready to attack, has now said that if Iran does go to war with the United States, it will be obliterated. Saber-rattling or a genuinely frightening flashpoint? Well, David Miliband, the Foreign Secretary under Gordon Brown, and now head of the International Rescue Organization in New York, is with me. In short, how worried should we be? Because President Trump has a history of, as it were, saber-rattling via tweet, but there does seem to have been a cyber attack by the Americans on the Iranians overnight.
Now, we should be very worried about the prospect, the real prospect of a hot war between Iran and the United States. We were 10 minutes away from that on Thursday night. There are people in the senior reaches of the US administration who want a war with Iran. They've said so very clearly. And there are some people on the Iranian side who are itching to get at the Americans too, partly for domestic reasons. What you've got to understand is that a war between the US and Iran will not be restricted to US and Iran. It will be a contagion right across, a conflagration
Saudi
across the
Arabia,
region.
Israel, and ultimately ourselves?
Well, Afghanistan is an obvious flashpoint. Iraq is an obvious flashpoint. And I think that it's very important. I think a Foreign Office Minister is going to Tehran today. That's a good thing. It's a pity he's not going with his European counterparts. But there are some very practical things that need to be on the agenda. I mean, one is about the safety of shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. Britain and the rest of the international community should be talking about an international force that ensures the safety of passage of all ships through the Straits of Hormuz. Secondly, the Iranians need to understand that their threat to flout the nuclear agreement that President Trump pulls out of can only provide excuses for those in the US and elsewhere who want to take them on. So I think we should be very worried, and we need some very active diplomacy.
The current Foreign Secretary and the former Foreign Secretary are, of course, head-to-head in the Tory leadership campaign right now. But would you like to see them, or at least one of them, pull out of that and organise some kind of international conference to reduce tensions?
I mean, the current Foreign Secretary has real responsibilities at the moment. I don't think we can afford him to be completely absent from the stage. Britain is a permanent member of the Security Council. This is a pressing global threat to peace and security. We're actually, I mean, I don't want to make people to choke on their cornflakes, but we're relying on the caution of President Trump to keep the hawks at bay in his own administration.
No, I suppose, to be fair, he said he was cocked and loaded and ready to attack, and he was then told 150 people would be killed if he did attack, and decided that was disproportionate.
Yes, but
why
Andrew,
he stood down.
It's pretty worrying that that question hadn't been raised
a little bit
in
earlier.
The preceding 72 hours when they were discussing the issue. Look, there's a general thing here. We're living in a world where the international rules and norms are being flouted day by day. My own organisation is a humanitarian organisation. We do health and education and protection for women and kids. We've had 2 aid workers killed in the last week. We've got record numbers of civilians being killed in wars around the world. We've got 70 million refugees and internally displaced people, speaking to a crisis of diplomacy, but also a flouting of global rules and norms that were hard won at the end of the Second World War, reinforced after the Cold War. And I call it the age of impunity. It's an age when there's a division in global politics. Been people who say, look, the law needs to be strengthened. Other people say the law's for suckers, and we can't afford that.
Meanwhile, you're over here partly to talk about Brexit. You've made a speech and done interviews and so forth. And here you've said that Labour needs to be the unequivocal party for another referendum. Don't you feel that there are huge numbers of Labour voters who will simply feel betrayed and left behind if that happens?
Well, the evidence is actually that there are 3 times as many Labour voters who feel betrayed by the position of not having a position than there would be. But I want to make a different point. In the end, we're in this mess because each party has tried to calculate what to do about Brexit according to internal party politics. That's how David Cameron ended up in the referendum in the first place. That's why Jeremy Corbyn is sitting on the fence. The Brexit issue is now a wrecking ball at the constitution of the country, at the political structures of the country, because each of the main parties has been thinking about its own sectional interest, and the public can see it. That's how you end up with the situation that we're in.
If you were still back in your old constituency of South Shields, which voted to leave the EU, would you be going back there and saying to people, I'm terribly sorry, but you were wrong, and we have to rethink this?
I would be saying you have a democratic right to make sure that the Brexit that is now on offer, which wasn't promised 3 years ago, is available. And I want to call attention to this. I would be following the neighbouring MPs to South Shields in Sunderland, Bridget Phillipson and Julie Elliott. I'd be following Anna Turley in Redcar. I'd be following Phil Wilson in Sedgefield. Those are all MPs today representing quote-unquote Leave seats, although they would say they're Labour seats. And they have bravely said, look, because the Brexit that you were promised in 2016 is not available, because no one ever thought a no-deal Brexit was the issue. You deserve the right, for democratic reasons, as well as social and economic reasons, to have a final say on whether we go ahead with this.
You haven't given up on British politics and the Labour Party, have you?
Well, I haven't given up on Britain, Andrew. I'm a British citizen.
No, sure.
So
but
I feel
a lot
that
of people listening to your views would say the trouble is, these days, back here, as a new Labour figure, you're kind of politically homeless. But it sounds to me like you're still very much engaged in the Labour Party and still feel like a Labour Party member who would like to have a voice in it.
I'm one of the few Labour Party members, I think, who actually voted Labour in the European election campaign. So I have to say, not because of the position of the leadership, but because of the position of the 2 MEPs who were running on what I thought was a very clear ticket. But look, this notion that our constitution, the integrity of the United Kingdom, never mind our economy and society, are under threat from this Brexit decision is real. And I go back to that very simple point. Hang on, let me make this point. If you're buying a house, you get the survey done. If the survey shows there's subsidence, you're not forced to buy the house. You can have a final decision. And that's why I think, for democratic reasons as well as economic reasons, it's the right thing to do.
Can I just make a point about Jeremy Corbyn? Because people say, you know, he's this very ideological figure, but perhaps actually he's a more Wilsonian figure, and he's been very cleverly playing party management, playing one side against the other side. And, you know, the Peterborough by-election, it has not been a disaster for the Labour Party. Up to now, he's done it rather cleverly.
Well, it's a very good point, but it's not so clever to end up with 14% in the European elections. We haven't had 14% Labour vote in a national election since 1910, when we only fought 50 seats out of 600. So it doesn't look so clever. And remember, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn did say, I'm the man of clarity and principle, and you count on me to tell you what I say. I would say this, that not just for electoral reasons, actually to appeal to Remainers and Leavers, the politicians are honour bound to stop playing with the unicorns. There isn't a jobs first Brexit, just as there isn't a GATT 24 option for the Tories.
What's your message? Caroline Flint's going to be sitting in that chair fairly shortly. To those Labour MPs who say, don't break faith with Labour Leave voters, try and get a deal. It's still possible to get some kind of deal which will help jobs and so forth getting out of the EU. No deal will be a disaster, but also no Brexit. Simply ignoring that referendum would be a democratic outrage.
My first message to Caroline, I saw her before the programme, is one of honour. She's a friend. I respect her, and the first thing I said to her was, how's the family doing? So it's important to say that. I think my message would be this. Look, the arguments that you're making against the second referendum, that it will prolong the agony, that it will fuel the far right, that it will divide the country, those are precisely the arguments against the deals that are on offer now. Every single deal that's being promoted, either a no deal or the Theresa May deal or a version of it, that's only the beginning of the negotiations, because the difficult negotiations are still to come. The far right is already being fueled by the failure to address this in an open and honest way. And as for the Labour voters, she and I know that Labour voters are voting Labour not because of the Europe issue. They're still voting Labour because they want to know whether their jobs, their health service and the safety in their community is the key issue. Okay. And I respect Caroline completely for the openness and honesty of her opinion, but I also point to the large number of Labour MPs representing similar seats who are confident that you can appeal across that divide.
David Miliband, it's been great fun talking to you. Thanks very much indeed for coming in. Now then, this week, Jeremy Corbyn tilted his policy more towards a European referendum, that's what we've heard, exciting many in his own party, but inevitably angering pro-Leave MPs. We've already heard about the letter. One of the 26 signatories is the Don Valley MP and former Minister Caroline Flint, who joins me now. Caroline Flint, I saw you roaring with laughter behind Mr Miliband there.
Wasn't that loud, was it?
I could see you rather than hear you. But this is a letter which sounds fairly menacing towards Jeremy Corbyn. You're saying this must happen, this must happen, this must happen. 26 names at the bottom. That's a lot of Labour MPs. Is this some kind of coded threat?
No, not a threat. I think the 26 Labour MPs who signed that letter and many others who've privately shared their concerns with me have been saying the same thing for a long time now. We won a situation in 2017 where we didn't win the election, but we returned better than we thought, and we did so on the promise of respecting the referendum and working to get a good deal. And those of us who signed this letter and others believe that we should respect that promise. Okay. And that is what has been Labour Party policy, and that is what is meant to have guided us through Parliament.
For those people watching who haven't read the letter yet, here is a relevant extract, the crucial extract. Brexit must happen, you say. The UK must leave and do so without further undue delay. A commitment to a second referendum would be toxic to our bedrock Labour voters. Now,
correct.
Correct. I suppose one of the questions out of that is: are you not likely to lose more seats to the Lib Dems than to anybody else if you don't go in the other direction?
No, not at all. I mean, when you look at the polling based on present figures, it is clear that, for example, in David's seat in South Shields that used to represent, that would go, all the seats in Sunderland, all the seats in Barnsley, across Wolverhampton, across Stoke, and many more. And those Labour Leave voters are likely to go to the Brexit party. So the danger for the party, and this isn't just about an electoral calculation.
So how many seats would Labour lose, do you think, to the Brexit party if you go ahead in the second referendum direction?
One of the polls suggests it's something like 40 plus. So the thing, and also to the Tories as well in that mix, but we would be losing in our heartland seats. And this isn't just about, you know, electoral advantage. This actually goes to the heart of what the Labour Party is about. If we do not speak for the working class voices of Britain, then what's the point of the Labour Party?
Can I ask you a little bit more about this letter? Because 26 Labour MPs, as I said, and you say you've been speaking privately to more than 26. Is this a block of Labour MPs who would now vote for a deal if a deal comes back?
I think those people who signed the letter would like to still have the opportunity to vote on a deal. And don't forget that when Theresa May was, finally forced to stand down, we were in discussions about what the withdrawal agreement would be like and changes to the political declaration. But I think it's also about us basically trying to be heard in the Parliamentary Labour Party and elsewhere about real concerns about what our party is all about, but also the people that we speak for in our constituencies. And that hasn't been given, I think, the due respect that it deserves.
Last time round, I think only 3 Labour MPs were still voting for the Theresa May deal, of which you were one. Now that we are that much closer to a no-deal exit and a different Tory leader, do you think that number is bound to go up by a considerable margin?
I think it will go up, but, you know, I've been to this situation many times before. I believe that the only way to stop no deal is to support a deal and for us to have an orderly Brexit. And the only way to do that is to support a deal. So I am, despite everything that's going on, I am still optimistic and hopeful that Parliament will do the job.
If I was Boris Johnson or Jeremy Hunt and won the Conservative leadership, an unlikely thought, the first things I would do is go to Brussels to try and get some kind of alteration or change of some kind with the withdrawal agreement. And the second thing I would go and talk to Caroline Flint and the other people who have signed that letter and say, in those circumstances, can I rely on your votes? Because if the answer is yes, then you overwhelm the relatively small number of hardcore committed Tory Remainers, and therefore the deal could finally get through and the country could avoid no deal. In order to avoid no deal, would you talk to a Johnson or a Hunt or whoever?
I would talk to anybody to stop no deal from any party. And actually, I think the underlying point in what you make, Andrew, which is correct, whoever becomes Tory leader, the truth is they need to get behind a deal. And
they need a parliamentary majority.
Yes, and they need a parliamentary majority. So whether it's Jeremy Hunt or Boris Johnson, they need to get behind a deal. I do believe, as I think Rory Stewart indicated during earlier hustings where he played a part, that essentially elements of the deal we have already got on the table, so to speak, will still be going forward. There may be some slight changes. The fact that we are having a new Prime Minister in EU language is an event, so that might open the door to some more discussions. But I think we are at a stage now that we really need to consider the health of the nation. I think the health of the nation needs us to agree a deal and move on.
So the next Prime Minister going to Brussels and thinking about trying to get a deal can, as it were, bank or at least hope for up to 26 Labour MPs in the voting lobbies when push comes to shove.
Well, I don't think anybody should bank on anything in this game that we are playing, and it is being treated by some quarters as a game which isn't helpful. But I think, yes, I think anybody who is going to be the Tory leader should think about how they reach out, not just to individuals like myself and the other 25 who signed that letter, but also, again, to the Labour Party. Because even in the Peterborough by-election, Andrew, our message in our scripts to voters, particularly those where people were thinking of voting for Brexit, was once we have Brexit, this candidate won't offer you anything on the issues of NHS, jobs and so on. That indicated to me that there is still within the party leadership an acknowledgement that actually Brexit is going to happen. And I want us to get onto those issues of the NHS and jobs, because at the moment, we're not getting a hearing on those matters either.
Similarly, reading my way through the letter and the quote that I put on the screen just now, I take it that those 26 MPs would vote against a second referendum if there's another vote on the subject in the House of Commons.
Oh, I think that is pretty clear. And because we do believe that, you know, it's not democratic to ask Leave voters to vote twice to prove themselves, but also, look, we have to respect democracy. I think we have to bring the country together. I think out there, outside of the buzz of Westminster and outside the media, there are both Leave and Remain voters who want to see progress being made. And let's get to the second stage where some of the real deals and the real negotiations will have to take place.
So this is a really big political moment, actually, because what this suggests is that it's much less likely that we have another referendum, and it is likelier that we have an agreement of some kind before we leave the EU.
I very much hope, Andrew, that is the outcome. I believe Parliament has not served the people in the way it's gone about this business over the last 1,000 days. And there have always been, as I've said, hardline Brexiteers and Remainers for whom no deal was ever going to be good enough.
And you would vote with Boris Johnson and against Jeremy Corbyn to make that happen?
I would vote for a deal that has the support of the EU 27 and a government if I felt it ticked the boxes that I voted for a deal before. And I voted twice for a deal before. But let's be clear about this. Boris Johnson has also been in the chamber voting with Jeremy Corbyn, as has Jacob Rees-Mogg, when I haven't been. So we've all been in a situation where we've been in the lobbies with Boris. The question is, why are we in the lobbies? What are we voting for? And I'm voting to leave with an orderly Brexit.
Absolutely fair point. One last question. If, right up against the end of the process, and despite everything you hope, there isn't a deal, do you vote for, do you go with no deal, a no-deal exit, or no Brexit?
I won't be voting to revoke Article 50.
So that means a no-deal Brexit, if that's what has to happen.
If that is where we end up, that is where I will be.
Caroline Flint, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today. David Olusoga has brought social history to millions of viewers with his A House Through Time series. Very good it is too. Recently he's been delving into Whitehall's dustiest documents for a new film, The Unwanted, The Secret Windrush Files. It's on BBC Two tomorrow evening at 9 o'clock. It's an exploration of what he calls a scandal that was 70 years in the making. David Olusoga says that the hostile environment towards Caribbean immigrants began long before the Empire Windrush ship even docked in 1948. I'm going to be talking to David in a minute, but here is a clip from his programme.
The story of 70 years of political panic, bad faith and racial prejudice in the corridors of power, stretching all the way back to the arrival of the first wave of Caribbean migrants on board the Empire Windrush in 1948.
The hostile environment is not new. There was hostility to Caribbean arrival before we even got here.
In this film, we'll reveal the confidential documents that lay bare the calculations and prejudices of some of our most celebrated political leaders. The steps they took to create an environment that was hostile towards black British citizens, and the plans drawn up in secret for discriminatory laws to deny their right to live and work in this country.
And so here is the professor in person. Now, anyone who watches this programme knows at least a bit about the Windrush scandal. We've talked about it quite a lot, including with the Prime Minister. What is there in this programme that you think will surprise and even shock people?
Well, I think there's two Windrush stories. There's the one that we think we know, the one about 492 people get off a ship, the beginning of this transformatory experience, creation of a new community. But there's a story that the documents tell us, which is not of an invitation to help rebuild post-war Britain, but of a deep reluctance to allow a black British identity for those communities to form.
And at the core of that, there is a confusion about what British actually means.
There is. I mean, there's two definitions of British, and you can see it in the documents. There's a legal, legislative version, which is about people's rights to come to this country as citizens of the empire. And then there's race. And what you have is a generation of politicians and civil servants who struggle to perceive of Britishness as not being racial, as not being the same as whiteness.
Now, there's a moment in the files where Claire Matley, that great Labour figure, talks about the dangers of an incursion of people from the Caribbean and actually suggests the ship is diverted to Africa so they can pick peanuts instead. Was that a shock to you?
I mean, these documents have been out for a long time. My shock's worn off. They came out in the 90s and the noughties. Lots of historians, Kathleen Paul, Clive Harris, have written about them. So I'm sort of rather used to them. But it is, I guess the difficulty I have is I was brought up in a working class family in the northeast to think of the 45-51 Labour government as so almost sacred. The NHS, the welfare state, and I still do have those feelings for that government. But when you look at their attitudes to race, immigration and the empire, it's a very different, less comfortable story.
Well, let's talk about another figure who is almost sacred to a lot of British people, Winston Churchill. Now, you say he thought about fighting an election on the Keep England White agenda. Is that real? Were those words you saw, was that a genuine possibility?
That was suggested by him, and his cabinet colleagues quickly ushered the idea out of the room. But I think what you see in the documents relating to Churchill is someone who's very interested, very concerned about coloured immigration, as he calls it, but also somebody who's determined to find a way to pass an immigration law that turns off the tap of coloured immigration.
You mentioned your own background. Your family was forced out of your house, I think, in Gateshead, was it?
That's right.
By bricks through the window in the old days of the National Front and so on. To what extent do you think that early experience has formed you as a historian since?
Well, it made me curious. I mean, I wanted to understand where this force that made me unwelcome in the town I was from, the town my grandparents were from.
A little bit of Geordie there, it's just about hear it.
After a couple of pints, it's stronger, I assure you. But I wanted to understand this force. When I was a kid, this is unbelievable now to younger black Britons, the Black and White Minstrel Show was still on TV. And I didn't know what this was.
And Lenny Henry, who was on the show earlier on, was in it, as it happens.
But I wanted to know where that came from. And so it made me curious about history.
But people have fought back against the prejudice as well. And you were in the playground with the young Paul Gascoigne, I read.
He was in my sister's year at school, yeah.
And he pulled you up after a fracas?
I have one memory of Paul Gascoigne, which is him picking me up because I'd been knocked over. He was one of the kind of tougher kids in the playground who wasn't racist. And that's my only memory of him, and it's a good one.
So when we start to rethink our history, and this programme is all about rethinking our history and seeing people slightly differently, and you've got figures like Attlee and Churchill, and you're going further back, you've got Rhodes and so on, the great controversy in Oxford, you've suggested not taking the statues down, but putting extra information at the bottom of the statues. Can you explain what you want to see?
Well, I don't think statues are history. Whenever we talk about this debate about statues, people say you're trying to rewrite history. We don't learn history through statues. Statues are about memorialising and heroicising men, and it almost is men, but only one side of their story. You don't get a full picture of Cecil Rhodes from that statue in Oxford. What you get is a heroic version. I think those statues need contextualisation, and they need the other side of the ledger put alongside the heroic image.
It's quite provocative, though. Here's Winston Churchill, Great War leader, but also a racist.
But it's true. I'm sorry. I'm on record as saying I'm really glad Churchill won in that struggle against Halifax in 1940. I fear, as the document suggests, that Halifax would have sought a peace deal with Hitler. But at the same time, this is a man who wouldn't accept the transportation of food aid desperately needed to Bengal. This is a man who expressed an awful lot of racial views, anti-Semitic views throughout his career. Both of those figures are true. Both of those Churchills are real. And a mature approach to our history is to see the heroic actions, but also the lamentable attitudes.
David Olasuga, fascinating to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for that. Now then, The Unwanted, The Secret Windrush Files is on BBC Two tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Now look at what's coming up on BBC One at 11:30 today.
On Sunday Morning Live, £150 million has been pledged to a university to investigate the ethics of artificial intelligence. Are robots a threat to humans?
Also, suggestions that women prisoners should have phones in their cells to call their children. Are we soft on crime?
And how a museum is using art to tackle anti-Semitism.
Join us at 11:30.
Not many really committed Brexiteers stayed the distance in Theresa May's cabinet. The most prominent of those that did is Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary, and he's with me now. Liam Fox, you're backing Jeremy Hunt in this campaign. You'll have seen across all the newspapers the backwash of the Boris Johnson fracas. Something or nothing?
Well, I think that the key thing for us to focus on is what candidates are promising. They are, after all, going to be our Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. For the Conservative Party, they're going to lead us into a general election. So we need to hear the issues, which is why I hope we'll see both Boris and Jeremy debating in public the issues. And I think that it's inevitable that there's a focus on private lives. That does not concern me. What I'm concerned about are the issues. And we're not going to have a single issue general election when it comes. We tried that last time. We're going to have a range of issues.
But you talk about promises and you talk about, the guts to do interviews and debates and so forth. Those are matters of character. Is it fair for voters to be asking questions of the character of the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom?
Well, of course it's fair to ask those questions, but I'm not sure that what we've seen in the last few days is a fair reflection of that. But what I do, your question's implicit. Why would I back Jeremy Hunt and not Boris?
I'm going to come on to that, but I was just very struck. I was watching the hustings yesterday in Birmingham, and Ian Dale did his best to ask Boris Johnson those questions and was completely blanked by Boris Johnson. Do you think that's acceptable in the course of a campaign for Boris Johnson simply to answer no questions about the private life at all?
I think it's always easier to just give an explanation. But I think again...
And move on, yeah.
And the key thing is then how you get onto the issues. What we can't have is it being a distraction from explanations about wider policy and where we go to and when.
Of course, for some people, there'll be worries about other stories dripping out at some point before or after the end of the campaign, and about blackmail and so on. The two ministers are discussed on the front page of the Sunday Times. Were you one of them?
No.
So you don't know about that conversation. Do you have any security worries about Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister?
Do you know, Boris has been the Foreign Secretary who is in charge of MI6, for example. Do you think that Theresa May would have made him the Foreign Secretary if there were genuine worries about him being a security risk? I think we've got to get away from these distractions again and talk about the policy issues.
All right. Now, one unexpected headline, I suppose, Fox backs Hunt. So you don't often see that. And I have to ask you about why, again, because you have been absolutely clear that it's really important to keep faith with the electorate and get us out of the EU by the end of October this year. And yet you are not backing the man, Boris Johnson, who says to his supporters that no ifs, no buts, come what may, we will certainly be out on that date. And you are backing the man who sounds a little more equivocal about that.
So I think that Jeremy Hunt has a good chance of being able to negotiate a new agreement with the European Union to get us out. It's 3 years ago today that I cast my vote to leave the European Union. Had Theresa May's deal gone through, we would have left the European Union at the end of March and we'd be in a completely different political scenario. So we have to find a way of getting that agreement through Parliament. Without a withdrawal agreement, for example, there's no implementation period to do anything at all. That's one reason. Secondly, I think that he, as an entrepreneur, understands small business. I think to win a general election, the Tory party needs to be the party of small business. We have to be the party of every white van man and woman, every corner shop owner, every small business owner. And then thirdly, I think that he understands another issue which you know is important to me, which is the armed forces and our veterans. Coming from an armed forces family, Jeremy has that experience.
There's almost no time to do a proper renegotiation before the end of October, and you yourself have said unequivocally that you're completely against an extension, and yet you're now backing a candidate who is likely to go for an extension. That seems extraordinary.
Well, I didn't say that Jeremy was likely to go for an extension, nor has he. What he said is, if we haven't got an agreement by the time we get to the end of October, if we can't get an agreement with the EU, we can't get an agreement we can get through Parliament, he said with a heavy heart we'll have to leave with no deal. I would still prefer to leave with a deal.
Of course. And if you're close to getting a deal, would you extend to get that deal, as Michael Gove, for instance, said?
Well, I think Michael actually put it very well. If you are in the process of leaving, if you have an agreement with the EU and you're having to put the legislation through the House of Commons, would it be rational to tear it all up at midnight on the 31st of October? No, it wouldn't.
So you could tiptoe into November, but not to the end of the year, sort of thing.
Again, Michael said, I thought he put it very well, if we had to take a few extra weeks to get the legislation in place to leave with a deal, that would seem a sensible thing to do. And I've actually not, to be fair, I've not heard Boris say that if that were the case, he would leave come what may.
But he's certainly told ERG people that he would leave come what may, definitely by the end of October. What's the last date that you would allow?
Well, I think that very point is why we need to be having the debate between the candidates so we can get these issues properly teased out and we know what the realities are that we face. You made the point in an early interview, of course, the parliamentary arithmetic doesn't change. We get a new leader, and the other side of the coin is we don't have a new commission yet to discuss these issues. The commission may not be in place till October.
Do you think Boris Johnson, or indeed Jeremy Hunt, could hold the Tory party in power for very long once they win this, given the arithmetic?
The key thing that I think my party needs to learn during this leadership contest is that we avoid external coalitions by maintaining internal coalitions. We have to be a broad party. We have to respect a range of centre-right views in this country. If we want to win a general election, we don't want to be a purist debating society.
But that means holding together Dominic Grieve and Ken Clarke on the one side and Baker and Rees-Mogg on the other side. That seems to be almost completely implausible in the current situation. You're going to be walking into chaos.
It's very difficult with our current parliamentary arithmetic. That's what comes of living in a democracy. We take the instructions from our voters as to what parliament we should have.
There's something I don't understand about the Hunt campaign, which is I understand that he thinks he's a better negotiator and will get something that nobody else can get. I understand that. But Plan B is apparently leaving without a deal. And yet he's also said that Parliament may well stop that. So what's Plan C?
Well, again, the key to it is getting something that Parliament will approve. And I've always thought that the key to that was
Plan A.
was the backstop issue, is getting that. And I think that the key to the backstop itself is the word temporary. Because
that's the negotiation, that's Plan A, but I'm asking you what happens if that doesn't work, because the Irish and Brussels and so forth are still pretty steely in their opposition to any change there. If he goes over, like so many previous British leaders, and optimistically asks for this and doesn't get it, then there's possibility of no deal, but Parliament stops that. So what is Plan C?
Well, I think that we have to be very clear with Parliament that we will have to find ways, if we can't get an agreement, for Parliament to agree to us to leave without a deal. If Parliament won't do that, then ultimately we're moving towards a general election in this country, and I don't think that's actually advantageous to us.
Which your candidate has called prospect of catastrophic and annihilation, big words like that he uses about a general election, if you're not out of the EU.
Well, I don't want there to be a general election. I'll tell you why I think we shouldn't have one. Because 3 years ago today, we voted to leave the European Union. 80% of our MPs were elected to leave the European Union. they should do so.
I completely understand why you think you should have a general election. It's fairly obvious. What I don't understand is how you're going to avoid it.
Well, of course, the point you made in an earlier interview is also valid, that governments can't just call general elections any longer. Parliament has to vote for there to be an election. So we could continue in this rather odd period unless Parliament is willing to do what it should do, which is honour the instruction that was given by the voters to leave the European Union. If Parliament had done this already, and a lot of focus has been on the 30-odd Tory MPs who didn't vote for it, but you've had a block of over 200 Labour MPs who flatly refused to do what it said in their manifesto.
What's your current feeling about no deal? Because originally you said you're not worried about no deal, it'll be fine or it'll be perfectly acceptable. And then recently in your language has become a little bit more nervous about no deal. Are you reading stuff, are you seeing stuff that we should know about?
I would rather that we had a deal. In terms of trade, it would clearly be easier if we had a deal. If we have no deal, for example, we're likely to face tariffs from the European Union. They've already said twice they will apply full tariffs to the UK. That would make our exports less competitive because our prices of UK goods in European shops would go up.
Bad for jobs.
And it's potentially bad for the economy.
And also, you know, you're a Scottish man who is an English MP, but nonetheless you're a Scot. What about the Union under no deal?
Well, as I've said, I think that there are a number of people, I think in Northern Ireland and I think in Scotland, who would try to use no deal or even the fear of no deal to try to drive a wedge into the union itself. And as you well know, because we've had this discussion before, I'm as much a unionist as I'm a Conservative, and the preservation of the union is important to me.
But there was an extraordinary survey of Conservative members, the 160,000 people, some of them, who are going to be choosing our next Prime Minister. 63% said that they would get rid of the union with Scotland if it was the prize for the Brexit they wanted. What's your message to people like that?
My message is that as a united kingdom, we're not simply a political entity. We are a family of nations. We have intermarried, we've moved around the United Kingdom, and we are a union of peoples, not a union of countries. And we are stronger and have been better together, and that's how we should stay.
Article 24 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, now 70 years old, which we were a signatory of, suggests that we could leave the EU and there'll be no changes to tariffs, there'll be no changes to quotas for perhaps 10 years while we negotiate a new free trade agreement. And that calms a lot of people on your side of the argument about no deal.
But it isn't true.
It's not true.
That's the problem. Article 24, subsection 5, it is, allows countries to deviate from what's called the most favoured nation principle. That is, we have to treat one another the same, give the same access to markets. There are two exceptions under that part of the trade law. One says if you're going to be in a customs union, and the other says if you've got a free trade agreement. But you have to have the agreement to benefit from any temporary relaxation.
As I suspect you can guess, I mentioned it because this is Boris Johnson's get-out-of-jail-free card as far as he's concerned, but he's also said that it shouldn't be a problem because we will negotiate a new free trade agreement having held back the money during the implementation period. As I understood it, if there is no agreement, there is no implementation period.
That's correct. So that argument doesn't actually hold. Two things there. If you don't get the withdrawal agreement through Parliament, there is no implementation period during which we can do anything at all. And secondly, if we leave the European Union without a deal, the EU will apply tariffs to the UK because you can only have exemptions, as described, if you already have a trade agreement to go to. And clearly, if we leave without a deal, it's self-evident we don't have that agreement. So Article 24 doesn't hold in that circumstance.
So
and I've discussed that with the Director General of the World Trade Organization, and the Attorney General has given us the same advice.
So that's something people need to know. Can I ask you, however, suppose Jeremy Hunt does win this contest and you are negotiating for him and we go through no deal, what's your answer? How do we get out of those problems?
Well, I think that we have to identify where there is potential movement. And I think that we've said that we don't want a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. The Irish government have said they don't want that to happen. We've said we don't want to be in a permanent relationship in terms of customs union. The EU said it's a temporary nature. If it is a temporary nature, and the EU agrees that, then we have to be able to then determine how long is temporary. That, I think, is the key to being able to get a negotiation.
So this is back to the same old argument that's been going on and on and on, because there are people who think we get out without no deal, then we're into a brave new world. Liam Fox does all his trade deals around the world, which you do, but presumably in the brave new world, we're still going to want to trade with our nearest trading bloc just over the water, the EU. And at the point when we knock on the door after leaving without a deal. They say, yes, we remember you. Well, first of all, we want our £39 billion, and then we want your Irish backstop guarantees, and then we'll talk.
And they will also apply full MFN tariffs to the UK, and that will be, as I said, a big impediment to our ability to export efficiently to the European Union. So if we get an agreement, if we get a free trade agreement with the European Union going forward, then we can continue the tariff-free trade that we have at the present time, but we have to get a withdrawal agreement through Parliament to be able to get to that stage.
We have got two candidates to be our next Prime Minister, both of whom are talking about taking us to no deal in one circumstance or another, quite soon. And from what you're saying, it does sound like it's a huge problem for British business, for the Union itself, and something that we should be avoiding at all costs.
But we have to be very clear that it is the legal default position in the United Kingdom. If we don't get an agreement, then we leave without a deal. And it's very important that we are very clear to the European Union that we would take that course, because without the ability to walk away, we have no negotiating capital with the European Union.
And I just put it, in those circumstances, after leaving, we would have to give them their money and their Irish guarantees in order to start talking.
Well, I think that you would not get a future free trade agreement unless you were willing to deal with the Irish issue. It is, after all, an international trade issue, which is why we're better to get an agreement, get a withdrawal bill through the House of Commons, and leave with an agreement that takes us into an implementation period when we can discuss that future trading relationship. It has always been the best outcome. There were lots of things about the Prime Minister's deal that I maybe wasn't over-enthusiastic about, but it was a way to get out of the European Union, and had we done so, we wouldn't be having this conversation 3 years after the referendum. We would have left the European Union in March, as we promised.
Liam Fox, thanks for coming in and being so frank. Thank you very much indeed. Now, thanks to all my guests today. Join me next Sunday when I'm going to be talking to Stephen Fry about gods, monsters and myths. And we're going to leave you now with a saxophone player who has taken the classical music world by storm. Jess Gillam is also the youngest presenter on Radio 3 with her new show and podcast, This Classical Life. She's here to play us out now, Pekania Sarda.